Hello and welcome to Personality Crisis. My name's Dylan Ris, and we are lucky enough to be joined all the way from Mexico City by Jay Watts. Jay, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so
Pleasure to be
Jay,
here.
you're part of an organization called Mexico Solidarity, which can be found at mexicosolidarity.com. Want to tell our listeners a little bit about the organization and what you guys do?
Yeah, so I'm technically, I guess the technical title, the editor of Mexico Solidarity Media, which is found at mexicosolidarity.com. And basically, it's a website that is devoted to sort of current news and analysis of what's happening in Mexico politically, coming from the left, with a definite focus on translations and stuff like that. So, and we also host Soberanía, the podcast, which is hosted by Jose Luis Guardado Ceja and Kurt Hackbarth, who are two journalists here working in Mexico, and that does like a weekly coverage of broader news of politically what's happening in Mexico. And not to get too long winded, but the overarching organization that does all of this is called the Mexico Solidarity Project, which also puts out a bulletin and is primarily organized within the states to give people in the states an idea of what's happening, connecting to the Chicano and Mexican community and migrant community, which is obviously very significant in the United States and to a lesser extent Canada.
Right. So you just mentioned the United States and Canada. Your name is Jay Watts, which is not the most Mexican name of all time. So maybe if you could just also explain your relationship to Mexican politics as somebody who didn't always live in Mexico, and how it connects to the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, so I'm from Canada originally, been involved in left wing politics there. I was the central organizer for the Communist Party of Canada for many years. I had moved down here 2000 and well, I guess 4 year or come down rather before move down 2022, working on a documentary about Mexican politics, sort of from the left, not just Morena, but some of the other more left wing groups, communist, socialist parties, unions, and stuff. I met my wife here. I stuck around. We had a kid, and so now I'm roped in. Then
Yeah. When you say the phrase from the left, I think that in those three countries, Mexico, Canada, United States, that phrase means different things. For those who are, listening outside of Mexico, what would be sort of a primer that you could give them about what from the left means in Mexico versus, say, the States or the
or
US?
Canada. Yeah,
Yeah,
so I mean, I guess I'm sort of more on the left than than most people in Canada and the US on the left. I
yeah.
am a communist as well, but I think I have a broader sort of view of the left, which includes people who are social democrats, left liberals, groups like that, which I think is probably a broad idea that is more prominent, certainly in the U.S. since the period of Bernie Sanders and whatnot, than it was in the 90s when I was growing up. And so I would say, I mean, in Mexico, it's a different situation. I think definitely than the United States, and even in Canada too. Canada has what I would say is a social democratic party, the NDP. It has had Quebec has had a sort of separatist social democratic party, which has maybe moved more to the right. There's more of a history of sort of labor engagement in politics with minority parties, so in a little more like a labor party kind of thing, which I guess isn't as evident in the United States anymore. Although I think that's changing. I would say in Mexico the difference is, yeah, it's, I mean, Mexico had a revolution, and in the Constitution from 1917, which is still in effect, was in my mind probably the first social democratic constitution in the world. It had extensive social rights, doesn't emphasize private property, things which are maybe not as common in Canadian and U.S. law, which tend to come from obviously a more property rights approach.
Yes.
So
And and
go ahead.
how viable in the highest levels of Mexican government are the left parties, in terms of again, comparing in the states or Canada to Democrats or liberals, uh, what should our listeners know about the strength and power that the left has in Mexico?
So I think, I mean, obviously, these are two very different historical contexts in that Mexico had a revolution, had this constitution, and then the left was sort of a constituent element of the government and the state after. And I mean, when I'm talking about the left, I'm talking about the communist Marxist like left,
Right,
right?
right,
I mean, it's not just Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo
right.
murals and art. It's also the parties that they were involved in and stuff like that. The Partido Popular Socialista, the communist Mexican Communist Party. So the PRI as the sort of governing party for 70 plus years, and I'm sorry, this is going to take a while
No, yeah,
to
do
describe,
please.
was had a manner of presenting itself from the left in terms of its developmental projects, how it engaged diplomatically, internationally, coming from the period of when World War II, before World War II, supporting the Spanish Republicans, things like that. That obviously was not always reflected domestically in the 1960s. Obviously, 1968, the massacre of left-wing students that happened. There was the CIA involvement, a dirty war, all these sorts of things. But historically, the left, in a way that the left hasn't been written out of politics in a way that I've seen in Canada, and that I think, anyways, not having lived in the U.S., that it has been, and so it was primarily co-opted. So Morena now, as it exists, is a broad party. Its origins are in the left, but it also has worked with what probably would be considered right-wing forces, such as the Social Equity Party, Equality Party, when it was first sort of connected to neo-Pentecostal movements when AMLO was first elected. But so there's broad currents within it. It's not anti-communist, certainly. But it's not a socialist organization either, although socialists are in there, as compared to, say, it has two coalition partners within the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies, and that's the Workers' Party, which is an explicitly socialist organization, which grew out of a bunch of Maoist organizations in the 80s, and the Green Party, which is not not too much like any Green Party, even in Canada, the US, or Europe. Sort of I don't think anyone would be shocked to call it more of an opportunist kind of party. It has worked with the right and worked with the left, but the left is very present within Morena. The level of which it can force itself to have an impact on the politics depends on what's happening really at that certain period of time. And now we're seeing sort of, I mean, the demand for the continued supply of oil, for example, from Mexico to Cuba, whether it's sales or else donations or whatever, is still a very urgent one that's being pushed on the left to Scheinbaum, who had stopped it, obviously, because of pressure from the United States. But there's things like that which are, the president is engaged in figuring out how to deal with pressure from the left, which exists, and as well pressure from their most important trading partner, which is the United States, which obviously does not have a positive view of Mexico-Cuba relations or the Cuban state.
In in the U.S., the left's base of power has changed over decades. It was for a lot of the 20th century powered by working people, by unions, more of a working class, take the lunch pail to the factory type of crowd. It has changed in the United States, and now it's increasingly just becoming like an urban rural divide between who supports Democrats or the leftmost wing of Democrats in the U.S. versus who supports Republicans. That's a broad statement, of course. In Mexico, what would you say the base of power for the left more elements of Morena and coalition partners? Where does that come from?
Working people, and then also a very substantial rural population here,
Yeah.
which is, NAFTA did destroy a lot of the countryside. Obviously, that initiated the mass migration to the states, and and that, but there's still very substantial campesino peasantry, which, you know, is not something that exists in Canada or the United States anymore. So that's it. But I think there is a broad Morena reflects all of society. There are urban professional types or whatever, which I think you would see more reflected in the cabinet of Claudia Sheinbaum. That's her background.
Yeah.
Her family's obviously from the left. I mean, from the
Mm-hmm.
from the communist left. Her grandfather was one of the founders of the Communist Party of Cuba. There's all of these connections, but she's obviously more of what I think people would see from, say, like a DSA kind of background, university educated professional sort of left. So
Yeah.
there's that left, and there's I mean, it's the largest hegemonic party for a reason, because it does reflect a lot of the interests of the Mexican population. But I would say primarily working people, which are the majority of the population, and the informal and formal. And yeah, that's about it. So
from your perspective and your group's perspective, as somebody who is a communist, what would you say are some of the positives and the negatives of, you know, Scheinbaum and her coalition, and what are some things that you're actually pleased with, and where are they letting down the lift?
So, I mean, I try to, obviously, I would love if Morena was a socialist party, if everything was going that way. But I also, that's not the case. And I don't think that's what they've laid out, or even what President AMLO had laid out, or the expectation of socialists and other people on the left who operate within Morena. Morena and AMLO came to power after 2 stolen presidential elections in 2018, because he was able to bring together this coalition, which was an anti-corruption coalition, an anti-neoliberal coalition, and that had certain ideas about how to change the nature of the Mexican state, to bring it back to a central place that, after 40 years of neoliberalism and very violent, like disturbing neoliberalism, I would say, I experienced neoliberalism in Canada since I've grown up and stuff, and it's obviously a lot different here. So when I look at what I think what the best elements of Morena, which I think are within what they try to do, is a national popular development model, which is to bring back proper industrialization, not the maquiladora sort of development of. So the central role of the state in organizing the economy. So, you know, I would love everything to be nationalized, but that's not what they're going to do. But what they have done, which is important, is returning the national energy utility to a primary place after years of privatization. Obviously, passenger rail, which can be a little controversial, but its return is very important. Reviving Pemex, the state oil company, which obviously in situations as we're experiencing now become even more important, and reviving health, and develop, you know, the pension transfer. What they call pensions here are sort of social transfers of direct cash payments to people. So those are some of the elements that I think are very good. One of the I think when we're getting into the issues with that, and this is what Scheinbaum's experiencing right now, is that those sort of pension transfers and things like that are good for helping stimulate the economy. Obviously, the increase in the minimum wage is very good. However, the tax base here is still, with a largely informal economy and a small amount of workers, the tax, and that means that taxes come from primarily the people who do work formally, and then sales taxes, which are regressive and very high. The tax to GDP ratio here, is very low. It's about half of what Brazil has. So now we see the conditions of economic slowdown. There's a lot of issues that have to be tackled here, and I think that my personal preference was, I think that Scheinbaum tends to be a little more, I don't want, let's say like a European Union style neoliberal, in a sense that she does, which is very good. And this is a substantial step up from what existed in the past 40 years. She believes in healthcare. She believes in a certain amount of housing, which she's building and developing, and welfare programs and transfers and things like that. But I think contrary to what AMLO had and what AMLO believed in, I don't think that she's as much interested in state-oriented development, in parastatal things or import substitution, sort of the classic left-wing project that AMLO was more and tied into. And so I think now we're seeing how what she's presenting with Plan Mexico, which initially was the industrial strategy offered last year, was quite substantial. I guess if you're familiar with industrial strategy, like on the likes of Korea in the post-war South Korea or Japan, anchor companies, et cetera. That's sort of because of the declining economy being sort of limited now to just looking for foreign investment. And even, getting rid of some restrictions. Recently, last week, it was announced that they would, that basically within 30 days, if your investment project is not being approved by the government, it'll be automatically approved. So things that are quite substantially what I would consider classically neoliberal are sort of finding their element way back into the Morena project, the Fourth Transformation Project, because of the economic circumstances that the government and the country finds itself in.
So you mentioned earlier on that a substantial portion of the left coalition in Mexico is rural, is people work with their hands. You also have mentioned, though, how a lot of that is a more informal economy than people might be used to in Canada or the States. And so is there a paradox there to be overcome? Because, of course, a lot of left movements have strong government to sort of oversee progressive taxation, for example, or redistribution, or just steering industry. Is there maybe compared to some other countries where the left coalition is made up differently, a real hurdle to overcome to get those people aligned with something that would be more formalized and more centralized?
Yes, but I think the bigger issue right now, and this is one of the sort of almost crisis level situations, is agricultural production and how it relates to free trade in this country. So we've seen 3 pretty significant national strikes by producers in the country, agricultural producers, what's called basic grains. So it includes corn, but also beans and sorghum and wheat and other things. And this is similar to what I've experienced in Canada. That producers here cannot compete with subsidized U.S. corn. The prices are set at the Chicago board,
right?
So they're being bankrupted. There are a certain amount of very small producers who are part of the Sembrando Vida program, which is very good, which is sort of an agroecological program for very, very small producers, allows them to stay on the territory. The government helps them with supplies, purchases a certain amount of what they produce. That's great. That is not scalable to what Mexico needs. 60% of corn is produced by these medium-sized producers who are going bankrupt because they just can't compete with what's coming from the U.S. The other issue is that unlike a country like Canada or like the EU, Mexico does not have the fiscal capacity to subsidize to compete with. So this is a big issue. And I think this also gets into what's going on with the CIA issue right now, USMCA renegotiations, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. Department of Agriculture looks very favorably on Mexico as one of the primary markets for exports, especially when there's been situations going on with trade war with China. China doesn't want to take as much, et cetera, et cetera. Mexico's sort of thought of as a favorable place. The issue is that, that there's a lot of people who already went through years of the destruction of agriculture from NAFTA and then USMCA, which are sort of at their limit. And this is how the state deals with this. I honestly don't know, because I think that they need to keep USMCA, or they see that they need to keep USMCA. But if they do, there's no space for what was promised from AMLO and even Scheinbaum, which is that Mexico attain food sovereignty, that it'd be able to produce enough for itself and to be consumed here. But it can't under the certain circumstances, and it can't. It doesn't have the fiscal capacity to subsidize enough, nor does it look like Scheinbaum is necessarily interested in raising taxes at that level to fund things like subsidies for agriculture or even universal healthcare. So this is one of the issues that I think is slowly, and maybe not so obviously outside of Mexico, sort of tearing at the coalition of at the Morena coalition, at its basis of support in rural areas.
Yeah, well, I think that's an important perspective for an American audience who sometimes thinks of Mexico as a agricultural importer to this country when it comes to things like avocados and tomatoes, certain produce, but then other staples, like corn or wheat or whatever. That's very heavily subsidized in the U.S. and there is that dominance there. One form of of U.S. Interference that you did just touch on that maybe has a more sinister undertone would be CIA involvement, where certainly there's a perception in the U.S. that Mexico can't govern itself, that cartels overpower official government forces, or that those government forces themselves are corrupt or on the take. Hence, the CIA presence is necessary and should be welcome, et cetera. Obviously, that is, that's one perspective, and I'm sure that there are different perspectives on the other side of the border. And I'd be curious, where you on the left side of Mexican politics, or even just the country as a whole, regards that messy web.
I'll try to articulate the Morena, the sort of more mainline Morena and Scheinbaum President Scheinbaum's position right now, which is that the big issue is that the United States is the consumer of drugs, that it doesn't seem to treat it as a public health issue, while at the same time the United States is the main supplier of weapons that cartels use, including things like like giant high caliber machine guns that somehow end up here. There's maybe one or two, this is repeated a lot of times down here, but there's one or two gun stores in the country operated by the military. You can't just go buy a gun anywhere here. So yet there's a lot of guns here showing up. So that's the position of
shipped with all the corn coming down, right?
Yeah, exactly. Probably, maybe.
Yeah.
See. So the position of the Mexican government, which I understand, is that those are issues that should be tackled together as well. That they want and welcome security, share intelligence sharing, et cetera, when it comes down to taking down kingpins or things like that. My personal view is a little bit to the left of that, obviously, and I think that's also a diplomatic position. I think the United States has been involved in, I do believe that drug laundering, that drug money are core constituent parts of the financial capital system of United States. I think that if you really wanted to tackle drugs here, you could do it, but the United States would get mad. I think the first thing you would do is say, we're going to fiscally audit every financial institution, including JP Morgan, et cetera, that operate in the United States, to see where the money is coming from, where it's going, how is that happening. Obviously, the United States would freak out in a second. So, and what's happening now, I think I think the CIA and the United States government, the Trump government, is using drugs as a pretext to fuck with Mexico, whether that's for something as simple as just pressure within the USMCA renegotiations, because they're asking for frankly crazy things. In October of last year, Viri Rios, who's a journalist here, writes for El País, which is a Spanish newspaper, was leaked a document with sort of the wish list of what the United States government wanted, and that included something as crazy as shutting down the foreign the body here which oversees foreign investment, and letting the United States determine who gets to invest in Mexico. Like, just astronomical things, as well as the sort of classic demands of opening all of the Mexican market. So, the transportation market here, there's has to be a high level of Mexican ownership, et cetera, all these sorts of things. So it's hard for me. I understand why Mexico is seen as a basket case, as a particularly violent place, but I see that as a direct result of that. It's being next to the United States. You're never going to get rid of that. And there's one country that has basically eliminated the drug trade, that has a severe policy, and that's Cuba. And why has Cuba done that? By saying we will not allow any of that. We're very specific about that. The general opinion here is, if it's in Canada, maybe in the US, it would be seen as sort of conspiratorial to say the CIA is behind all these sorts of things, the DIA, et cetera, et cetera. In Mexico, the general opinion is yes, that these organized criminal groups exist, that Garcia Luna, for example, the former attorney general who's now in jail in the United States, the DEA knew that he was working for a long time with these drug cartels. They worked with them. They sort of look the other way. There's like everybody, the standard opinion in Mexico is that the United States is, this is something that we have to manage. The United States is not just behind it because it's a consumer, or it's, and once you get rid of it, that's, if they, that it'll ever really be properly dealt with in the current situation, certainly in the current situation that the United States is in. I mean, I don't know how you feel, but I don't think that someone like Donald Trump really gives a shit about.
No, I think that Trump is on a personal level, I think he is hopeless. He's a guy who, obviously acts from purely selfish means, and he's not even good at what he does. He went bankrupt 6 times in the private sector. Why should anyone expect that in his public life it's going to have a better outcome, even when he's representing the whole government? So I think, to the extent that he remains, he's still going to be the president for another 2.5 years, and everyone's just going to have to endure his idiocy. However, after that point, there will be someone else's president. I don't think your Mexican audience needs to worry that he's going to run again in 2028. As bad as he is, that's not happening. But so whoever will take over for him will almost by default have to be more sensible about trade and international relations, et cetera. That could range from the unfortunate end of the spectrum, someone like a JD Vance, who's just right out of Trump's existing cadre, and it could go to any number of Democrats. From the Mexican perspective and the Mexican left perspective, what is within the bounds of realism, which you've couched many things, what would be the hope for a future U.S.-Mexico relationship with respect to trade, but also with respect to a reassessment of the cross-border drug and weapon issues?
That's a very good question, because it's a very complicated, almost schizophrenic issue, which is an AMLO sort of commented on this. Scheinbaum's a little more into it. Scheinbaum, I think, does believe in, and she has said explicitly, deeper economic integration with the United States, also with Canada, as sort of like an EU attempt, like an EU kind of bloc. My personal opinion is I don't think that's realistic. I don't, Puerto Rico is not a state. Why would Mexico all of a sudden be treated as an equal in that relationship? Even Canada isn't, and I think Canada is notorious as a sort of like servile to the United States on any level and is never treated as equal. So I think that's a really complicated question that is coming up because of the USMCA renegotiations, right? Historically, Morena, its base does come from from an anti-free trade, anti-FTA, then NAFTA, like base. That's the Mexican left has been that for decades. That is not the position of Marcelo Ebrard, who's the current economy secretary. That's not the position of Scheinbaum or other people in the cabinet right now. I think there's a reluctance within, at this moment, I think there's a dispirited feeling amongst the Mexican left as well as the Latin American left because of everything we've seen since last year, since Trump moved into the Caribbean and started murdering people from the sky. Like that, that the response from the Latin American left, as Foreign Policy magazine even said, was very wanting. It's all of a sudden, it seemed like just people just sort of like step back and were like, oh, how is this happening? This shouldn't happen. It's bad. Maybe the UN should step in. In my view, and in the view of a lot of other people, that led to January 3rd, to the kidnapping in Venezuela. That led to the extreme, the heightening the blockade and more attacks on Cuba, et cetera. That led to probably where we are right now with the CIA interference within Mexico. I think that, so what Mexican left might want to see from a new relationship or anything like that is just complicated by what's going on right now. And what I think that a lot of people are just like, well, we hope we get through USMCA renegotiations without it being too terrible. And, I would have hoped for a more aggressive stance on it, but I understand why people feel the way they do. And so there is some of that hope too, which is that, well, hopefully in 2.5 years, there'll be a Democrat in the office and it won't be as hard to deal with things. But also, it's not like AMLO and the Democrats had, like under Biden, had such a great relationship, including on issues like the CIA or DIA kind of fucking around in the country as well, too.
Yeah. I think it's reasonable to expect, though, whoever the Democratic nominee is, that just from their own base, they're going to be pushed to have a different perspective on some of this stuff. I mean, Biden, I think, was largely regarded as a well-intentioned man who was stuck in the past because age caught up to him faster than others, and that that in many economic matters, Obama let down those on the left in the Democratic Party, and this, the anger and the frustration that came from that sort of spawned the DSA and the Bernie wing of the Democratic Party. I mean, that was when Obama was president. So, that comes from a lot of disappointment. It's not merely a reaction to Trump. And indeed, a lot of Trump's movement, even though their solution to the problem is completely opposite, and I would argue they're less informed overall, it comes from the same levels of frustration. So I think that whoever is the president taking office in 2029, I do think that they are going to be pushed by voters to not do neoliberal business as usual, just more of the same that began with NAFTA in the early 90s. That would be my prediction.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the issue is that, like, obviously Trump's critique of NAFTA is somewhat based in reality. The loss of certain industrial jobs, a lot of stuff did come to Mexico. The solution that he sees too, as well, is not necessarily good for Mexico either, no. Right? And which is tariffs on goods and things like that. Like Mexico, I mean, this gets to a really complicated question, which is to what extent Mexico has its own economy. And there's the sort of legalese, which is that since NAFTA, no international company operating here can be treated differently than a Mexican company. So it's considered a Mexican company, Coca-Cola or whatever manufactures here. So, there was been a lot of talk from the government that, wow, Mexico avoided all of these tariffs. This is amazing. Well, Mexico avoided the tariffs because it's primarily American companies who make stuff here with wage lower, a lot lower wage prices, and export it to the United States. 85%, 86% of exports from Mexico go to the United States, and that's primarily American, but also European multinational corporations that operate here. So that relationship, it's I don't know. It's what, however it is, even whether it's a Democrat, obviously it's going to be better if it's a Democrat than it is right now. But Biden was still, the unions and stuff like that within the United States that say from the left offer support for Mexican workers here. They do that on the understanding that they want wages to be higher here, which would be a good thing, but so that jobs don't go down there. If there was some magic way where wages here were at the same level as the United States, but I don't know, but jobs were still coming down here. Say there's some magic government subsidy or something like that. Unions would hate that too. They don't. The American unions, unfortunately, like Canadian unions, I'll say too. There's not. They have a self interest in that. That's fine. That's understandable. But that sort of politicking is very present in the Biden, like how they looked at Mexico too, right? Which is that this is a place to export agricultural products, is a place to manufacture and to bring
and I mean, that's in no small part because a lot of American swing state areas are in hollowed out, formerly very industrial places where there is still some union presence, although not what it once was. But in the upper Midwest, the area that's sort of adjacent to Ontario and where there was a lot of cross border, especially in the car industry. And so a lot of Americans politicians appeal to those people the same reason that in early primaries, they have to appeal to Iowa, big corn producer, because Iowa votes first. So a lot of policy is set by places in both, agricultural manufacturing sector, both of which have struggled here. But then as a result, to win those votes, politicians have to float unfavorable plans that are unfavorable to other USMCA countries.
So I mean, I think this is the big.
No.
I think it's just a big question that's going. I think that everything is connected right now to the USMCA renegotiation, including what potential there will be for the Mexican economy, whether this really means that they're going to set in the maquiladora model, which is definitely what the U.S. under Trump wants, or if there's going to be any possibility that the Mexican economy is going to be able to develop with its own industry and also look for other trading partners. I think the idea of Latin American integration was a lot more present 10, 12 years ago. It's been beaten down a little bit recently, but I think that for me anyways, that seems to be, it's not, there's always a sort of a wishful thinking that comes on a lot of people on the left here throughout Latin America, which is like, well, if we just partner with China, it's going to be amazing, right? Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, because of the relationship of the United States and Mexico and the proximity, I think that's unrealistic. China has its own interest too, that whether they want to be propping up the Mexican economy as it transitions away from the US, I don't know if that's realistic. But one thing that has missed, and this comes down to the diplomatic issue, the issue with Cuba, is that Latin American integration, whether it's through CELAC or ALBA or Mercosur, is just kind of gone. When this is the moment when it kind of needed to be happening, that the Latin American economies should be coming together, working more closely with each other. So we'll see what happens through 2026 with the USMCA renegotiation. But
do you think that if the USMCA renegotiation is particularly unfavorable to Mexico, that could be the spark that spurs this Latin American reintegration, where there's more of a economy that is less dependent on U.S. for export?
I think it would send a signal to other countries, if they see how Mexico is treated within that they should do it. I think Brazil's just already doing that. It has a high level of industrial development, integration with China and whatnot. So it would impact, I think, Colombia, how Colombia looks at things. But yeah, I mean that's another issue I think with the government, is that there's Morena and the fourth transformation itself has been very good usually at articulating a path through things and what happens if we don't achieve what we don't. So AMLO on energy reform, there was a plan B, there's a plan C, there's constitutional reforms. What happens? Because for most of AMLO's period, he was in a minority situation, or he wasn't able to just pass everything through the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. Sheinbaum has a little more power in that regard. But there's been no discussion about, okay, what if these terms are unacceptable? What would happen if Mexico says no to certain things? So it's really scary, I think. So,
well, lot to be discovered in the coming months. Where
yes.
can people read your work and just learn more about all the projects that you're working on?
Yeah, MexicoSolidarity.com is the media site. It's updated every day, but from there you can also access the Mexico Solidarity Project.com, which also has more work sort of in the United States. There's chapters being developed there, which are solidarity chapters, and I mean, who knows what will happen? Hopefully not, but I mean, they might be required, as the United States seems to be a little more aggressive about its intervention within Mexico.
Great. Well, thank you, Jay. This is a real pleasure. Jay Watts. And we have learned a lot about the current state of the Mexican left as it relates to all the countries in the USMCA and to all the hope and possibilities that exist in Mexico as we speak. So MexicoSolidarity.com, MexicoSolidarityProject.com. Jay Watts, thank you so much.
Thank you.